So a while back, I saw a question in a forum, and I thought, well, this could be interesting to talk about. So I flagged it to make a video about at some point and figured I should probably get around to actually doing that. The question was, would Jesus have been burned at the stake for his miracles if he had been born in the Inquisition? What if he had been a woman? Easy answer, maybe, maybe not. See, this is one of those questions that seems kind of deep and interesting, but then you unpack it and maybe it isn't so much. But there's some good stuff to think about in exploring the question. And so I think it's worth at least a quick dive in. Now, I assume this question it was kind of asked as a gotcha. Like, it seems like it fits in with the idea that interpreting Jesus as a witch is something new and revolutionary, or that religion in general, or Christianity in particular, is indicted by pointing out that when women have magic, they get burned at the stake, but men become prophets of religions. Now, I think that that idea of interpreting Jesus as a witch, that's like something that most people who get into witchcraft or get into magic have crossed their mind at some point, especially if they grew up pretty heavily churched. They look at the life of Jesus and they're like, wait, his miracles, that was just witchcraft. Oh, he had 13 people that went around with him. That's like, or 12 people that went around with him. That's a total of 13. That's like a coven. Really, the 12 are the ones close to him. He also had several women who traveled with him in addition to the men, and then there were a bunch of other followers on top of those. So the 13 number kind of falls apart. I personally think it's more interesting to compare him with Dionysus, and there are some historical comparisons and comparative mythological readings that address those overlaps and why those overlaps occurred based on when the story of Jesus developed. But that is a whole separate thing that's bigger than now. Right now, we're just kind of looking at the idea of, well, was he a witch? Would he have been seen as a witch? Is this a gender disparity, the way that he was viewed versus the way that a woman would have been viewed, either at the same time or 1,500 years later? Now, the thing is, the idea that Jesus was a witch or a magician is not some revolutionary new idea that people have hidden away or that is suddenly discovered by current magical people. And the idea that Jesus became this prophet who got away with his magic because he was a man, whereas a woman would have been prosecuted for the same, is also not really true either. These are kind of like late night weed thoughts. But again, they're kind of late night weed thoughts that we can learn something from if we actually take them apart. So here we go. Before the Reformation, and now the Reformation period largely overlaps with the period of witch trials, and while witch trials start occurring before we have our key initial reformers, there were already reform minded preachers and reform minded theologians influencing the church. And we could see some of the heretical movements before the witch trials, like the Waldensian movement, as a prototype for the Reformation. There's a lot of Protestant ideals that are there, and later Waldensians do end up getting involved with some of the Protestant movements that come along. So there was already some Reformation stuff happening before the actual Reformation. And that Reformation stuff that was already happening involved indicting society for its bad behaviors, including for witchcraft. So we can kind of talk about the period of Reformation post Martin Luther, but we also need to look at what was going on leading up to that and leading to those ideas, because those were significant for developing everything that happened. So before the Reformation, and even during the Reformation, there were people who were considered holy people who had visions. They gave prophecies, and sometimes they performed miracles. The Reformation had a greater scrutiny around such things, like and here we are kind of talking a little bit more about some of your thinkers in the Reform period, your actual Protestants who were separating from the Catholic Church and forming new movements. Because we can talk about reformers as in people who wanted to stay in the Catholic Church and just reform the church itself. Now, these early Protestants, these people who were against uh, these ideas of these visionary people and holy people performing miracles, they had an impact outside of their own movements. See, the Inquisition didn't create scrutiny around this. The Inquisition was primarily looking for heretics and people who had visions, people who performed miracles. They weren't necessarily heretics. A lot of times, what they were saying lined up with the church, and so the church sanctioned that. The church approved those people. The church treated those people well. But it did have methods for investigating some of that and verifying that these visionaries were seeing things that were good, that were coming from God, verifying that they were actually performing miracles. That was something that they did do, but they were maybe a little bit lax about it. It wasn't a huge concern. But then with the Reformation, there was an increase in scrutiny, and they became more restrictive in the exploration of such possibilities because of the way the Reformation attacked the church over these things. So today, when we think about Protestantism, we might think of some of our weirder elements of Christianity as existing in that space. So, like stuff like snake handlers, faith healers, people getting taken by the Spirit, people running through the church up and down the aisles, people speaking in tongues. Those are things that you would expect to see in certain types of Protestant spaces, but not in traditional spaces like Catholic and Orthodox churches. Now, again, we wouldn't expect to see that in all Protestant churches, but it's definitely not happening in traditional Christianity. It's only Protestant spaces where we're going to see those things. Those sorts of Protestant spaces, that more charismatic Christianity, and not necessarily the denomination, charismatic Christians, but uh, those sort of charismatic elements, they come from 19th century American Christianity. And that form of 19th century American Christianity, which was very tied up in the idea of prophecy, that also gave us the New Thought movement. And so it gave us the Kabbalion. And indirectly, that form of Christianity through the New Thought movement gave us the New Age movement and shaped a lot of the magical thinking of modern witchcraft. But those weren't the sorts of Protestants that were around during the time of the Inquisition and during the time of the Reformation. The Protestants then were a lot more straight laced and buttoned up about things. The Reformation challenged the way that people saw the world. It challenged the existence of the supernatural and the miraculous because the presence of miracles within the church was used by Catholics as proof that they were the true faith. So, in the medieval and early modern period, people understood there being the phenomena of the natural world. And that was all those things which relate to physical reality and occur normally through nature. Some of those things can still be magical. So, like talismans that were created based on the astrological timings, or magical healing based on the powers of stones or herbs, and even the use of certain prayers. Those were things that fell within the powers of the natural world. They were just part of the regular functioning of nature. These are things that God has ordained as normal that kind of run like clockwork and are just like what exists. Then there were preternatural occurrences, and those were things that were caused by spirits. And now this is something where, to some degree, some of how this is categorized may have been a response to the Reformation as well, because sometimes certain types of spirit things may have been seen as supernatural, but then kind of tightened into like, no, it's this sort of middle zone between the natural and the supernatural. Then you have your supernatural events, which are caused by God or by divine power moving through someone or something. So, royalty. Royalty was believed to have the power to heal, and that was a supernatural power because that was something that was given to them by God. The same presence of the divine, the same connection to the divine that gave them their divine right was the presence that moved through them that allowed them to heal people. So you could have a supernatural thing like a strange heavenly body appearing in the sky, or even a person being born in a way that was dramatically physically different and seen as unnatural, might be viewed as a supernatural occurrence in which God is sending some sort of portent to tell people about things that are going to happen or about his opinions on the world by causing this thing to happen as opposed to the way that nature would normally have it happen. So those were things that were seen as supernatural, where God was somehow interceding in the world, or where God's power was flowing through someone or something to intercede in the world. And debatably or arguably, when the devil is treated as the archfiend opposite God, that might sometimes be seen as a source of supernatural power as well, as opposed to lower spirits that would be seen as preternatural. But that, again, not necessarily a consistent thing. Not everything was always seen one way through this entire period of hundreds of years across multiple empires and kingdoms and princedoms that had slightly different, sometimes significantly different cultural elements. But this is sort of the basic idea. This was kind of within a Catholic worldview. That was how things were seen. And reformers didn't like that. The reformers saw a much flatter world in which only the natural world was relevant. So the age of miracles, all these miraculous things that happened back in the day, that's recorded in the Bible and it ended with Jesus. So nothing really existed with preternatural or supernatural causes after the life of Jesus. And this isn't an idea that is completely unique to the Protestant reformers. Most people are aware that the Greeks had concepts like this too, where you have sort of the golden age of the gods, the silver age of the heroes, and the iron age of mankind. You have ideas like this in Judaism, where you have the age of the patriarchs, then the prophets, and then the sages. And as you get further and further away from creation and further away from the revelation at Sinai, then measures of holiness leave the world. And so measures of visionary experience and access to the divine in certain ways leave the world. And so this is kind of a similar thinking that the reformers are setting up. And I can't say that the reformers were looking at Jewish esoteric philosophy, or that the reformers were looking at Greek structures from mythology and mirroring that. I think the reformers were just sticking it to the Catholics, that they were just like, you know, they got a good point. If they've got miracles, they're the true church. Well, screw them. How do we shoot that? You know what? There are no miracles. They're lying. They're the bad guys. That's what the reformers were kind of doing there. And so the reformers claimed that Catholics faked miracles or worked with the devil to achieve them in order to dupe people. It was a way for the church to keep control, a way for priests to take money from people, a way for priests to have power and to abuse people. And so they claimed that the priests and the monks were licentious, thieving liars, and that they were using the miraculous to keep themselves in positions of power to abuse the people. Because again, the Protestantism did take on kind of a more populist tone in some ways. Like in a lot of ways, it's incredibly anti-populist. It erases popular culture, and it's significantly more crushing in its absolutism, in terms of ideas of behavior, and in terms of sort of viewing humanity as bad. But they also taught that everything should be in vernacular language. They taught that people should have access to the Bible, that people should be able to understand their religious service, that people should have greater access to their clergy or to clerical positions, and that those should be more within the community. So there were populist elements to Protestantism as well. So the idea that they're saying that the Catholics were abusing the people and taking from the people, it fit with a lot of the rhetoric that was already there. The idea that the church was essentially just building itself up by taking money and wealth from everyone, and setting itself up as this worldly idolatrous power. And so the idea that the miraculous wasn't real was basically that you either had really clever priests who set up mechanical tricks in the church and set up ways to sort of create these illusions, make people believe that these miraculous things were happening, or that the priests were actually either in league with the devil or duped by the devil, but were in some way working with the devil in order to create actual false miracles. And either one was horrible. It didn't matter which one it was, and it could be a combination of both. The church had some incidents where the miraculous was proved to be fakery. It was proved that some of the things that people claimed were not really happening, and that they had set up things to make it look like they were happening, and that there may have been some kind of sketchy and inappropriate relationships going on between the people involved. So there were events that the Protestants were able to use in order to attack the church this way and make it look like the church was faking these miracles, or that the devil was actually behind these miracles. Now, conversely, the church claimed that miracles did happen, and they were proof that God was with the church and that the people of the church were holy. They even, at some points, claimed that the discovery of the fake miracles proved the reality of the other miracles that were not faked. So, even into the time of the Inquisition, and continuing through the time of the witch trials, because there were witch trials that kind of kept going past the point where the Inquisition was like, yeah, this probably isn't real and we're not interested in this. The church recognized people as having visions, people doing battle with evil spirits, people healing others through their holiness. They recognized some pretty magical seeming people. And what might surprise a lot of people today is that many of these holy people recognized by the church were women. Excuse me. Apparently, I need one of these holy people to show up and clear up this cough for me. So these women, they might have performed miracles. They might have saved the souls of others. They might have even had prophetic visions that sometimes influenced royal courts. Some of these women were very, very famous throughout their region or even throughout their country. And some of them had noble patronage involved, or even had the attention of kings and queens. These were kind of big things. And again, a lot of times it was women that were in these positions. Some of these women were also under the patronage of men who prosecuted witches. So this isn't a sort of thing where, okay, this was going on and then this kind of stopped and then witch trials happened. This is a thing where these things were both going on at the same time, and sometimes the same people were involved. When you read about some of these women, their powers and experiences don't sound too different from witches. They would leave their bodies and fly through the air and interact with spirits and see far off places. But they were seen as powerful figures who were holy. So, this idea that any woman who exhibited any kind of spiritual power or special capabilities was automatically viewed as a witch and automatically killed is just not true. Um, Even for magicians in general, even though all magic was condemned as coming from the devil, and this is something that Protestants were big on, but Catholics did it too. Catholics left a lot more room for magic that was not malefica, though. Even though magic that was not malefica or not evil magic was still viewed as coming from the devil or being a trick of the devil, it wasn't seen as harmful. And there were a lot of times where the church even officially said, just ignore that, don't go after that, that's fine if people are doing that. There were even points where there were some types of magic that were sanctioned and considered okay. But even after that point where we weren't seeing magic that was sanctioned and okay, uh, in as broad a sense, once there was more of a pursuit of magicians, you still had working service magicians. So, like, cunning folk who were out there who were fine and who weren't being accused of witchcraft, or where accusations against them weren't pursued, or where they were cleared. There were a lot of cunning folk in the North Atlantic Isles, and there were similar roles throughout Europe where there were lots of people who they were working magicians and they were able to be working magicians through this period. So it's not just these holy women that weren't prosecuted, but you had regular people also who were engaged in magic and could be men or women who weren't charged or accused or prosecuted either. So the idea that if you just own some herbs and a cauldron, that you were like fit for the pyre, it's not a real thing. So, as far as whether or not Jesus would have been at risk, we have to remember that the level of risk was not just like you're walking down the street and suddenly you're a witch and you are in the dungeons being tortured and are about to be murdered. Like the number of people that were killed versus the number of people that were alive at the time is actually really small. So it would depend on where Jesus was, who discovered him, and how his actions were marketed more than anything else. Being in a Catholic country would potentially help him over being in a Protestant one. Things were often worse in Protestant countries, like your places where we see some of the worst witch hunting. Like the German Empire is generally considered the worst, and by the time it is really bad there, that's within the time that it was primarily Protestant, if I'm not mistaken. Scotland's often brought up as being pretty bad, although Scotland, it was like there were large numbers in a short period of time, but there's not as much evidence of the extreme types of torture that there were in the continent, and most people were strangled rather than burned alive. So there's some ways that Scotland maybe isn't as bad, but it's often held up as one of the worst places. So being in a Protestant country, there's a lot more that you could get in trouble for, though. If he preached stuff that rejected the church, he would probably get in trouble. But if his visions lined up with what the church thought was okay, he might be fine. If he was in a wealthier, more cosmopolitan area, even if he himself wasn't wealthy, then witch trials were less of a risk in those areas. So, like if you were closer to where the seat of government was, or if you were in a more developed, wealthier urban area, those were areas that tended statistically to have fewer trials. If a priest or a wealthy pious noble discovered him and gave him patronage, that would probably help. And in the right circumstances, he might have become a saint. If he was in a more poor or rural area, he'd be more at risk. Traveling around unmarried with a bunch of men, especially if they had left their wives to travel with him, would put him highly at risk. Now, this wouldn't specifically be an accusation of homosexuality, but because he was undermining the standard domestic lifestyle and the social order that went with it, that was something that would be a problem. And that's something where that plays a lot into witchcraft accusations. Witchcraft is dangerous because it breaks the social order. Witchcraft has a lot of its symbols that violate domesticity because of its tendency to break the social order and break traditional concepts of domesticity. And that's true regardless of whether we're looking at women or men in regards to trials. If someone was single, then they were at higher risk regardless of their gender. So the fact that he would be potentially seen as breaking up marriages, as pulling people away from work and contributing to society, those would have been things that would have put him at risk. And that's the kind of thing where this is not just a witchcraft thing. Like other areas of society, you could be doing things that were illegal or things that were not considered exactly okay, but lots of people did them. And so it wasn't necessarily a problem until it started undermining the way things are supposed to work. So during the same period, King James the of England and Scotland, he probably had a bunch of boyfriends, which when you think about how he is generally thought of in witchcraft communities and his role with publishing a translation of the Bible, and a lot of the thinking about him is kind of off from what the actual history is. But it's still kind of ironic that this is this thing with this king who did this biblical translation and was out there to get these witches, but he loved these men in his court and praised them and spent all this time with them and wrote them love letters and poetry, and that would have been kind of okay. There were a lot of royals who had favorites who it seems like they may have had intimate relations or romantic relations. That type of thing doesn't seem like it was entirely abnormal between men at the time. But if it became something that was disruptive, that's where it became a problem. And so there's a lot of contemporary writing about James that kind of belittles and accuses and suggests things about him, and that shows that there was kind of a negative sentiment about these relationships. And some historians theorize that it was because there was a view that it put the royal court at risk by having these people who maybe shouldn't necessarily have as much power as they had in the royal court or as much influence as they had in the royal court there because they were James's lovers. So there's sort of the same idea there, where it's not necessarily the homosexuality; it's the disruption of the social order and the ability to upset what's supposed to be happening in society that would have been the problem, which honestly was also kind of Jesus' problem historically, at least in part. If he spoke out against injustice, then maybe that would have hurt him. But if he was a priest or a monk, he could possibly become a famous preacher by doing that. It really depends. Uh, the context and the exact nature of what he was saying would have been the things that would have kind of determined it. But sometimes, even being a priest or a monk and being very vitriolic and speaking out about the ills of society and about excess and decadence and degradation, which were popular things for a lot of really popular, important preachers of the time, uh, that could still get them in trouble if they pissed off the wrong people, and that could lead them to them getting executed. They weren't usually executed as witches, though, but occasionally that happened too, where you have a cleric who was framed or accused of witchcraft because they pissed off the wrong person. So the idea again that being outspoken, being someone who pushed the wrong buttons of the powerful, that meant you would get accused of being a witch. Not so much. There were other ways to deal with people like that. Generally, people believing you did witchcraft got you accused of being a witch, or being in a situation where bad things were happening and they needed a scapegoat and they needed an explanation for those bad things that were happening, and you were close to them, could get you accused of witchcraft. Sometimes in some places, just breathing could get you accused because they were accusing everybody. But in your more normal situations where there's specific accusations coming from specific people, a lot of times there was something that people were seeing, something that made people think something was happening, whether it was a person's actions or it was just misfortune. Talking about things politically, being vocal politically, there were other ways that could get you in trouble, and they didn't need to try you as a witch for that. They could try you under all sorts of political things. So, if someone looks at the life of Jesus and says, man, that dude was a witch, 1,500 years later, he would have been put on trial. Again, maybe, maybe not. There isn't an easy answer. It would depend on what the exact decade was, maybe even the exact years, what place he was in, who was in power at the time, and then a handful of other factors. His gender would likely have nothing to do with it at all. Even though about 75 to 80% of people who were victims in the witch trials were women, there were places where those demographics completely fall apart. Um, a lot of that has to do potentially with circumstance and the types of jobs and roles that women were involved in, and how those could put them at higher risk for an accusation. Some of it does have to do with perceptions about who was more susceptible to the devil. But also, if we contextualize witch trials within the larger category of heresy trials, because a lot of the accusations were the exact same. Some of the trials, you can't tell the difference between a witch trial and a heresy trial looking at some of the 15th century trials. Then a lot of that gender imbalance starts to disappear because the heresy trials were much more oriented towards men, even though, again, the charges were the same. So, probably not going to be a big function of gender. Because, again, we saw that you could be a woman doing things like what Jesus did, and that could put you in a really good spot as well. His socioeconomic status, and there is probably some reasonable argument that Jesus wasn't actually poor, even though that has been kind of the popular rendering of how we understand Jesus for the last 2,000 years. The socioeconomic status would also probably have been less of a factor than most of the other things that we've mentioned. Because while, yes, more poor people were victims, there are also a lot more poor people in general. But you would see accusations against people of all sorts of different socioeconomic statuses. And people who were in these more positive roles also came from all sorts of different socioeconomic statuses. So that wasn't going to be a deciding factor in and of itself. As to the idea that Jesus was a witch, Well, again, like we said before, that's not mind blowing or new. In the Bible, the local religious leaders claimed that he was doing magic by way of conjuring and commanding demons. This was how they explained his miracles. He denied that that was the case, but that was the perception that people had locally. In a lot of artwork in late antiquity, he's depicted holding a wand. And so that was a visual indication that he was a magician. And so that shows us that a lot of Greeks and Romans saw him as a magician in a time that was not exactly contemporary with him, but at least contemporary with the early development of his mystery tradition and the religion that grew out of that mystery tradition. There were also a lot of wandering prophet magicians at the time. Uh, Apollonius of Tyana is one of the ones that gets brought up a lot, but it wasn't like he and Jesus were the only ones. It wasn't unheard of to have people going around doing magic and preaching ideas. And there were older traditions in the Mediterranean of magician, mystery tradition clerics who would travel around and initiate people into their mystery traditions, perform magic, do miracles, and teach strange teachings. That was a big part of the Orphic tradition, and so that was kind of a thing that was commonly part of the Greek and Roman world for centuries by the time that Jesus was around. So, not some devastating insight that the world has ignored. There are even academic books that talk about the idea that Jesus was a magician. As far as the idea that he became the basis of religion because he was a man and as a woman he would have been killed, again, like we said, there were a lot of holy women who were viewed as prophetesses and who did miracles who overlapped with times when witches were killed. So it wasn't automatic that if a woman had these experiences, she would be labeled a witch and be killed. There were also a lot of female saints who had miracles associated with them, and some of them had very sexual visionary experiences that were viewed as holy experiences, and they were canonized rather than murdered. So there is actually like a solid history for the placement of these women religious figures, and a lot of that has been underexplored. A lot of these people who weren't made saints but who were still important religious figures of their time, they're not explored in popular history very much, and there's probably something that we're missing out with that. And so rather than paint this picture that any woman would have been taken to the pyre but a man would be a prophet, maybe we should look at the lives and experiences of some of these women who've been forgotten, because some of them are pretty interesting and there's things to learn from them. There were religious movements that were founded by men that were hunted and killed during the same time as the witch trials. Again, the heresy trials overlapped with witch trials. Sometimes when there were fewer witch trials happening, there were more heresy trials happening. And the heresy trials killed a lot more people. The Waldensian movement is often seen as kind of a precursor to the image of the witch that was used in the witch trials, and that was movement founded by men, founded by a man. It's a movement that often people point to it and say, like, well, they had such a high position available for women, and that's part of why they went after them. But again, the numbers don't line up with that reading of it. The history doesn't actually line up with that reading of it entirely. So the biggest thing that falls apart in that argument, though, is that Jesus himself was killed for his preaching. So while there's an element that points to sedition and stirring up crowds and civil disorder as reasons for his execution, it's pretty clear that the core that led to him being arrested and led to those charges was because he was upsetting the local religious authority. So he isn't an example of somebody escaping that fate. The idea that he would have been branded a witch if he were a woman, but he got off scot-free because he was a man, kind of falls apart because he didn't get off scot-free. He did get killed for what he was doing. So again, the original question was probably not posed with genuine intentions. But it is a good question for looking at some of the factors that were in play when witch trials occurred. So the Jesus part of it is kind of the salacious, exciting part, I suppose. But really, what we can kind of look at with that question is what was actually happening during that period from the 14th through the 18th century, what people actually were thinking, what people were actually experiencing, and what shaped those experiences and what shaped those thoughts. That's kind of where this mind experiment, this thought experiment of, well, what would have happened to Jesus during that time takes us. Honestly, in the late 14th and 15th century, in terms of some of the other factors that were going on, there were some major shifts in social structure, particularly in terms of economic mobility. And these shifts were a result of large portions of the population having died off. So, like, we kind of think of the Middle Ages as this period of feudalism, and we think of feudalism as going on for like this really, really long time. But you see, depending on the area, that kind of determines when feudalism sort of started to kick up. But you get some places where it's in like the 11th century, somewhere it's a little earlier, somewhere it's a little later. But then in the 14th century, we've had famines happening, we've had the plague happening, we've had crusades. Things are falling apart. It's a mess. And so you have things where they're the person who would have inherited land isn't there to inherit it, and so you get people who are the survivors who are inheriting multiple inheritances that they wouldn't have had otherwise. You get people who are able to move into places that are just vacant because there's no one there to inherit it. People who are able to take possession of clothing and tools and accoutrements that are above their station in life, and people who were able to say, like, you know what, I don't have to be tied to this land that I was born on. I can move to another place. I can go find other places where land is open, other places where there'd be a better person to rent land from. And you start to get a different way in which that relationship between the landholder and the people farming out the land and working the land, renting the land out from them, worked. You start getting a little bit more mobility, a little bit more freedom, and some of the bases that led into to capitalism start to arise there. So you've got a lot of major shifts in what's going on economically, and a lot of that is stuff where it makes some of the power and some of the perspectives of smaller lords and of landholders a little bit not where it was before. They're a little unsure of what's going to go on, and because people are able to push back a little bit more because now you don't have as many people there to work the land, or people who are stuck there having to stay on the land their whole lives like they were before. So you've got some things that are going on that are pretty shaky in your socioeconomic foundations and structures as we get into the late 14th and the 15th century. There's also questions about the status of the church as a power that endorsed the state, or the state as a power that controlled the church as we move through the 15th and 16th centuries and later. And this kind of connected with the instability in terms of power dynamics, then, and sometimes even in case of succession or the ability of countries to make alliances through marriage or otherwise. And these issues where people were kind of like, okay, well, who is it that we can pass the crown to, where it's not going to screw up the religious standing of our country, or, well, we can't marry our princess to this prince because our princess is Catholic and that prince is Protestant. These kind of questions that led to more instability, led to more potential for war. These fed into the fears that exacerbated the witch trial situation. This idea that society was crumbling or was on a precipice, and that the religious structures of society were under attack, and that the devil was stirring up his army to take over through these witches, and that was making God more and more angry and hastening the apocalypse. This idea that everything could fall apart, that there was no potential for peace, that was all tied into this idea that the apocalypse is hastening forward, and that was tied to the idea of witches and why people needed to be afraid of witches. So you've got a lot of things that are shaky and kind of confusing for people in terms of like who has power or why they have power, and what that means. So if Jesus preached the way that he is depicted in the Gospels, which is much more fierce and antagonistic than a lot of modern depictions, he would have likely been executed. Maybe as a heretic, maybe for sedition or treason, maybe as a witch. Now, I think it would have been his politics more than anything else, which is kind of ironic, because again, as we've said, like the idea of the outspoken political person being tried as a witch is not as widespread and rampant as people like to think. Now, there are examples of magic as political crime, magic being associated with treason and sedition. And even in kind of normal cases of witchcraft in England and Scotland, because witchcraft tended to be tried when there was a crime committed by witchcraft, we'll see things where peasants may have used magic against their local lord or against some local landowner, which adds a bit of a political dimension, but still isn't like this sort of political uprising or political outspokenness. Jesus would have been politically outspoken, though. He would have been someone who, if he had a following, would have been viewed as problematic and seditious. So, again, I think he would have been executed for his political views, and that it might not, probably not, probably wouldn't have become a political charge, sorry, a witchcraft charge. But that would also, again, depend on where he lived and when. Even the execution would have depended on where he lived and when. Like if he was born in the late 17th century or early 18th century, especially if he was well off and educated, and he could write and publish his ideas instead of wandering through the streets preaching them, he might have become an Enlightenment philosopher instead of getting executed. If he was born in the late 14th century or sometime in the 15th century, and he's running around talking about how all these ways people are treating money and focusing on money and trading in the temples and the monetary abuses of the churches, and that people should be giving up their wealth and helping the poor, instead of building cathedrals, he might have gotten in trouble then, because he would have been attacking symbols of power, symbols of status that were particularly in flux at the time. So a lot of it depends on when and where and exactly what he was doing. So I think if we kind of pull gospel Jesus and we update his message so that it's more relevant for whatever time period he's in, then again, I think he's got a great risk of political execution, um, if he is in the earlier part of the early modern period. If he's getting towards the later part, if he's getting towards the Enlightenment, then he might just kind of fit in, and then wouldn't be at as high of a risk of execution. So, again, time, place, specific activities. Those are the kind of factors that you'd have to look at. But you also have to look at the factors of the time. You have to look at what was happening, what the ideas were at the time, what the stressors were at the time, what people were afraid of, what people were concerned of, what things would be triggering to a government or people in power at the time, and make an assessment based on that. And when we start doing that, then we can start to understand more what actually did happen during those times. The people who were victims, the people who were killed, the people who were hurt by what was happening during those times. And again, that wasn't just witches. There were other types of heretics. There were people who were part of Protestant denominations, or there were people who remained Catholic. Uh, there were lots of different things that people were killed for in those times. So looking at that broader picture is also important. That's also something that we want to understand when we're trying to think about how it worked then and what the threats were, and how that what that tells us about society in general, and what that tells us about patterns in society, and when we start comparing that with how things are today. Because that's, again, one of the big parts of that sort of history is, what does that tell us about society moving forward? Can we see those same patterns happening today? And what do we do about those patterns when we see them? So, again, maybe not the greatest, most earnest question, but I think it did give some interesting things to think about and talk about. And I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.